I'm David Priess, and this is the Lawfare Podcast, December 29th, 2021. Because we are all trying to relax a bit for the holidays, we're giving you something a bit different for today's Lawfare Podcast. It's an episode of Lawfare's new podcast, Chatter, in which Shane Harris, or I, or occasionally both of us, have extended one-on-one conversations with fascinating people working at the creative edges of national security. In this episode, Shane talks with Noah Shachtman, the editor-in-chief of Rolling Stone, who got there, in part, from his work as a national security journalist. It's the Lawfare Podcast, December 29th, Chatter, with the Rolling Stone's Noah Shachtman.
This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, Rolling Stone editor-in-chief Noah Shachtman on his journey from musician to national security journalist to running the most storied publication in music.
And we were like, oh, well, we'll be the Scream, and they'll be Scream, and everybody will be able to know the difference. It's like, no, you're not, you fucking idiots. And so we did change the name of the band, I think, after our first or second gig. Later on, the drummer for that band moved to Seattle and joined a band called Nirvana. And the name of that drummer is Dave Grohl. You know, I love all my colleagues that worked at BuzzFeed at the time, but I think that's why, in retrospect, publishing the Steele dossier, that was a really bad call. I'm just dumb about this stuff, and I'm like, hey, I got this crazy idea. Why don't we put the good stuff at the top of the story and put the boring stuff later, or better yet, not really at all.
Noah Shachtman, welcome to Chatter.
Hi.
Are you between like photo shoots with Adele and lunch with a Korean boy band right now?
I am. Actually, kind of.
Are you really? Is that who you're? Is that we're keeping waiting right now?
Maybe not the boy band part. Maybe people writing about the boy band.
Have you met Adele yet?
I have not met Adele because the photo shoot we did with her had to be so closed that we sent a very, very, very small crew to go hang out with her.
So you haven't met Adele. Who's the coolest person you've met so far?
You, Shane.
Oh, God. See, this is going to get off to such a great start, despite any technical issues we may or may not have been having. So for listeners who don't know, they know you are the editor of Rolling Stone magazine.
Yep.
They probably don't know that you were twice my editor and that you cut your teeth as a national security reporter before you were running America's most iconic music journalism publication.
True. And in fact, I'd like to say that, I'd like to think at least that, some of the tricks you and I got up to are, added to me getting this job eventually.
What would be the number one trick? What's the thing that we did together that helped you become the editor of Rolling Stone?
Yeah, I don't know. But, I did bring up the other day, remember that time we did that story on, what was it, like Qatar Airlines or like UAE Airlines did a fucking like some dog and pony show in DC.
Yes. Yes.
And you got on the plane, remember this? And
yes, and it never took off.
Yeah, and drank like literally all of their booze. And we called the story like my $786,000 flight to nowhere.
Yes. This was such a good story. This is when we were at Foreign Policy together. It was it was this promo where they had like some new menu and wine service on like whatever Dreamliner, Jetliner, blah, blah, blah. And the whole event was they brought everyone to Dulles, sat us in the first class cabin, and were serving like foie gras and Chateau de Cam on a plane that never left the terminal. That's still one of my favorite junkets. That was good.
God, that was awesome.
That actually speaks to, I think, your instinct as the editor on that story was to play up the most absurd aspect of it. I mean, it was absurd, but like your idea was like, no, just go with the absurd angle, lead with that. And the story just kind of took wings, no pun intended, which has kind of often been your instinct, right? Is to find this sort of, you could call it the spiciest or the most hilarious or sometimes the punchiest angle in an interview and bring that to the front and not just let that be kind of, revealed in the course of the interview, but to really put that in front of the reader and make it about that kind of absurd or even obscure angle.
Yeah, look, I've got like a 75 IQ. So like I'm just dumb about this stuff. And I'm like, hey, I got this crazy idea. Why don't we put the good stuff at the top of the story and put the boring stuff later? Or better yet, not at all. What do you think of that?
Maybe we call it the lead.
Yeah, it's so strange. No, but look, on the real, look, I think hopefully this is a little less the case now, but especially back then, there's just too many people swallowing the official story of whoever was pumping out the official story, whether it was Silicon Valley or some company or the Pentagon. There's too many people swallowing too many official stories and kind of running with that as ground truth. And I think that's dangerous in any kind of reporting. The junket's kind of a ridiculous example, but it was particularly dangerous on national security reporting, right? Where, that was right at the height of the Snowden kind of storm. And, we were hearing, you remember how many fucking sky is falling. Oh my God, the US will never be able to collect intelligence again. Kind of, pants shitting briefings we sat through. And it was like, and it just all turned out to be wrong and lies. Right. Yeah. And so I think, one thing that, you've done throughout your career and that you and I did a lot together, both at Foreign Policy and then at the Daily Beast, was just like piercing through those like baloney official narratives and trying to get at real ground truth. And, I know it's been part of your work at the Journal and at the Washington Post, too. So, anyway, I just feel like, accepting the official story is almost never the right idea.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in the context of Rolling Stone too, because now you're at this publication, which is, you're interacting with some of the most famous and influential people in culture. And as I learned from my brief foray working at a magazine in Hollywood, these are not exactly people who necessarily like the most probing questions and are used to being handled and managed in a certain way. So we'll talk about that. But I just want to start at the beginning with you, because you do it's. I said when you got hired for this new job, I think the tweet that I had was something to the effect of, and I was obviously very clear about my personal affection and loyalty to you, having worked with you for so many years and known you for a long time, but that there are sometimes when somebody says, we've hired X person for this job, and you go, that makes all the sense in the world. And that's how I felt when you got this gig at Rolling Stone. And so I kind of want to walk people through, I think, why that made so much sense, because you have a background, you went from being a musician to being a journalist in national security and now to this position. But just talk me through from the beginning. So you grew up in New York. Where did you grow up? And what did you want to be when you were a kid?
Yeah, I grew up in New York's Greenwich Village, which was sort of pre-gentrification, where it was more like artists and old ladies sitting in their fold-out chairs out on the sidewalk, and less, fucking hedge fund dipshits. And both my family and my kid friends family were very much in the music business or adjacent to it. So my oldest friend, when we were growing up together, his dad managed Blondie and Roberta Flack.
Wow.
My grandfather had come up running jazz clubs in the 50s. And then when I was a kid, was more doing Broadway. I was producing big Broadway shows and was had a couple of venues in Philadelphia and New York. And so, it was around that. My mom would brag incessantly about, until my ears bled, about being at the Beatles' White Album party. She, when I was growing up, I was a little too young for it, but I would seethe with jealousy as my uncles would get to meet, Stevie Wonder or Diana Ross or whatever as they played at my grandfather's place. So, the music was definitely something I grew up in, and my dad is a pretty good classical pianist, and I definitely wasn't into classical, and tried to take classical piano lessons and failed miserably. But when I was 14, I desperately wanted to start playing in bands because that seemed like the coolest thing ever. And I got my uncle's bass guitar and, started learning it and started playing in kid bands. And the difference is when you're playing in kid bands in New York City in 1985, that doesn't mean you like play your eighth grade dance or whatever. It means you get to go play CBGB's, like Legendary Rock Club. And so I was able, like at an early age, to play at these like iconic places. Sort of the story me and my buddies always love to tell is how we were too young to get into CBGB's to audition there, to play there. So we had to like sneak in to play the audition, and then we passed the audition, and then, before too long we were like headlining on Saturday nights. So there was it was just really cool, and so I loved playing in bands, and there was a great scene, and like almost every single band in New York rehearsed at the same studio, and so you just got to meet a million great great people and great musicians, and I did that through college too. And
you went to college in DC. You went to Georgetown.
I did. I went to Georgetown, and we had a band in Georgetown that kind of. Well, here's a funny story. So we get this band together in my freshman year, and we're gonna call the band The Scream. And then we're told, no, you can't do that. DC already has a famous band called Scream. It's a punk band. And we were like, oh, well, we'll be The Scream, and they'll be The Scream, and they'll be Scream, and everybody will be able to know the difference. It's like, no, you're not, you fucking idiots. And so we did change the name of the band, I think after our first or second gig. Later on, that band, the drummer for that band, Scream, moved to Seattle and joined a band called Nirvana. And the name of that drummer is Dave Grohl.
Heard of him.
Yeah. So that was kind of fun. Like we're going to steal Dave Grohl's band name. Anyway, so, we play at 930 Club and venues around town. And sort of did that for a while. Was also in politics for a little while after graduation.
You worked on the Clinton campaign, right? Bill Clinton's 92 campaign?
Yeah, I did. And then worked for the Clintons a little after college. And then was in New York. After that, did some stupid jobs and got fired from one of them, and didn't really know what I was going to do. And so I started freelancing a little bit, freelance writing, and really kind of picked up on music again. And luckily, all those kids I had sort of grown up with in New York, like they all had record deals by the time I came back.
Wow.
And or a lot of them did. And so, was able to kind of like slide in and play with a lot of great bands, in the sort of like late 90s and into the 2000s. And so, and I was sort of like, I'd go on the road, and then I'd kind of write freelance until, it was kind of like a side hustle when I was home.
And what subjects were you writing about as you were playing?
Yeah. I'm a nerd, as you know. And so I was writing about technology a lot.
Yep.
And then, these passenger jets hit these two big buildings in my neighborhood in New York. And so I was like, whoa, this is big. But I was so clueless as a journalist, honestly. I didn't even know how to like report on the story or do anything or even go down to the fucking pile. Like I didn't even have that basic move in my arsenal. And so what I did instead was just kind of, I don't even remember how I stumbled on it, but I was like, there are these robotic planes we're going to send after Osama bin Laden. This sounds interesting. No one's written about those. And so I wrote this story about, I don't even know if we used the word drones. I think we might have used like disposable planes or something like that. But I did that story for Wired.com, and like everybody was like, whoa, holy shit, this is super interesting.
Yeah.
So slowly over time, I started writing more and more about the military and technology. And so by 2003 is kind of on the eve of the Iraq invasion. I felt like I was 32 years old and it was ready to for me to make a choice of music or journalism. Was I going to be a musician the rest of my life, or was I going to really go fully into journalism? And so I said, okay, I'm doing my last tour and I'm going to just do journalism full time. And so I thought I was kissing music goodbye forever. And, went on to.
Why did you make the decision? Why did you pick journalism over music?
I think I was probably better at journalism. If I'm being honest, and also it just felt like in that moment, what was going to change, what was going to impact things more, me, in the back of a van, playing a club in Cleveland, or, me trying to write about stuff that seemed to be right at the center of world affairs.
So you really wanted to make a difference. I mean, you wanted your work to have a broader impact.
Yeah, Shane. I mean, look, we're all egotists, right? And so, we're not doing this just to, write for ourselves. We're doing it to, be out there in the world. And so,
right. Did you feel that way as a performer too? I mean, did you did the performance aspect of music as opposed to, I mean, in addition to obviously creating and playing music, but did the performance aspect of it appeal to you?
Oh yeah, I love that. I also love the getting really wasted aspect of it. I love the camaraderie too. I really love that. I got to say, the thing I miss the most in some ways is the camaraderie you have when it's just 3 or 4 or 5 of you, traveling around the world. It's really special, and I think it's something you and I have a couple of times had that in journalism, and that's what I've come to learn is that that's super rare, super super rare. And I think honestly, today's environment is a little less conducive to that collegiality, but it's something I really do miss.
And I as you know, my background in college was in theater, and I did a lot of sketch comedy, and you do get from journalism sometimes, particularly when it's in these smaller environments, that feeling of camaraderie because you're collaborating, you're all working together on a goal. You care about it. It is creative. I mean, journalism is a creative profession. I think sometimes people discount that. And I can remember in the times where, because you and I worked together once when you were running news for Foreign Policy magazine on the website, and then when you went to go take over the Daily Beast. And I think that, at FP, it was a much scrappier, leaner operation, which not to say the Daily Beast was a hundreds persons behemoth, but when you are really kind of in the trench with somebody, you get more of that kind of that feeling of you're highly dependent on the other person in a way that sometimes in a big newsroom, the responsibilities and the burdens are spread out, which is nice because you can do a lot and you have a lot of resources, but it doesn't always have the same kind of intimacy.
Yeah, totally. And then, look, that crucible at FP, produced some really good reporters, right? It was you and me and John Hudson, who's now your colleague at the Washington Post, and Dan Roth, who's now at the Post, and Gordon Lewbold, who's now at the Wall Street Journal. So right there, you've got, that's half the national security reporting in town.
It's pretty good.
Pretty good. And then, so anyway, I was doing this national security reporting, was able to, travel a lot, as and go to bad places and do stuff like that. And, obviously, I always loved music and I'd try to gig on the side, and I was able to do it for a little while, before my kids were born. But then, especially I love and, played a lot of reggae music, and staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning was not exactly conducive to raising children and also having a full-time job. So I really, the last big gig I played was, we played with this old reggae cat named Lee Scratch Perry, who passed away recently, actually. Played with him at Central Park at the big stage there. And that was kind of my last real gig for a really long time. And so, I was just headlong into journalism, and really, never, ever, never thought I would be able to combine the two. It was like the furthest thing from my mind.
Right.
And then, I got a call from Gus Wenner, who is the president of Rolling Stone and the son of the founders, Jan and Jane Wenner. And, we kind of took it from there. And, I think Gus would say this too. The process of interviewing and vetting and blah, 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 and negotiating took forever. It took months and months and months, but it was pretty clear to me from that first call that, this was sort of meant to be.
Yeah. I think the place where probably people who follow national security reporting will remember first encountering you was when you started and ran the Danger Room blog, which was really, this was and people forget this now because, blogs kind of seem like ancient history to some degree, but this was really in the early days of blogging, period. Yeah. And I think had to be one of the first, if not the first, like substantive and consistent blog about national security, about tech. Just talk a little bit about forming Danger Room and how that came about.
Yeah. So first was in 2003. This is really super early. I started this blog called defensetech.org.
Right.
And I did that because it sounded super fucking official, even though I was like a dipshit that didn't know what I was doing. I'm serious, within weeks, the Washington Post had called it and were like, maybe we want to buy this from you. Like, wow. Yeah, it was like sort of an instant, like it scratched an instant niche that people didn't know they had. And then that kind of fizzled. And then the blog was actually bought. It's so weird, but it was bought by this company called military.com, which was like an old web play where they'd put up military related content and then try to like sell you shit. Like it was all,
that sounds like somebody else will like quick grab the URL.
Yeah. No, but the people who ran it were super smart. And then they sold that to Monster, the job site. I know.
Oh yeah.
It's super weird. Anyway, so I was doing some writing for Wired on the side, and then eventually basically they had me recreate Defense Tech, but under a new name. And we came up with I'm a comic book guy, and so we used the name of the kind of a training room in the X-Men called Danger Room, and that name sounds super cool. And so we started that, and started that with a woman named Sharon Weinberger, who is currently running Yahoo's DC bureau and is an amazing national security journalist.
Yeah, she's terrific.
Yeah, and I would note probably seems to be the only reporter in town that has like treated the Havana syndrome stuff with enough skepticism. Anyway, she and I met at this is so awesome. We met at a directed energy weapons conference.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
given the Havana syndrome connection, which people think is maybe the result of a directed energy weapon. All right, go continue.
Yeah, and in fact, at this conference that Sharon and I went to, there was some Yahoo who was pitching a quote unquote voice of Allah weapon, in which they were going to project microwaves into someone's head and tell them that, God wanted them to stop attacking U.S. forces or whatever.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, we met at a directed energy weapons conference, and that's how I met my work wife. and so then we started Danger Room together, and mostly because of Sharon, but a little bit because of me. We had like a big story right away, which was it's long and convoluted, but basically we got a hold of this document that showed that the Marines were asking for these like super armored up vehicles in Iraq, and that the request was kind of sat on or turned down. USA Today had a piece of it. We had a piece of it. Anyway, it was a big fucking deal. They became these things called mine resistant armor protective vehicles, or MRAPs. The Pentagon wound up, after reading our stories, wound up buying like billions and billions of these things. And they proved to be a real, technological advantage in the war in Iraq. And So anyway, we were kind of off the races from there. And so, I did that from, while writing features, it did that from 2007, I think it was 2007, sounds right. Maybe it was 2006, to 2013. And then, you and I hooked up at Foreign Policy for a while, and then at the Beast, and then over here at Rolling Stone.
Yeah. I remember in those early days of blogging, there was this great concern, I think, largely among people who'd been in journalism for a long time, that blogs valued voice over experience or opinion over actual reporting. But one of the things that, you did at Danger Room that I have to say, I think very few people were doing it well at the time, was that it had a voice and it had like an attitude and a posture, but it had real reporting. And it kind of seemed to me that this was, an early test case of you can do both. Yes, there were plenty of blogs that were basically just more like opinion columns, and sometimes people opining on things that they really didn't know anything about, but just doing it very forcefully. And you guys, it seemed like with Danger Room and really everything you've done, but you were not trying to there was no trade-off. It's it could be edgy and it could have a voice and have punch, but it had to have real information and real news.
Thank you. I have nothing to add to that.
There you go. So when you went over,
I think there were two, at that same time, guys like Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias were doing blogs too. And it's kind of like there are two different paths you could go by. You could go by the don't know shit about shit and just have a bunch of opinions about something and present those arguments so forcefully that people would start to believe you. And maybe they were even right, or who knew? And that was kind of like the Ezra and Matt approach. And then, for me, I felt so underwater in my subject matter that I felt like the only way to kind of get my head above water was to report through it. And kind of learn, get to know people. Now, look, I'm sure I haven't looked back at those stories, but I'm sure some of them are cringe, man. I'm sure we took the official line either too seriously or, especially on the technology front, maybe we're, too bullish on certain kinds of technology or whatever. I'm just making stuff up, but
sure.
I haven't even looked. But I do have, from those days, I've got my, a first cover story I wrote, for the Village Voice on, that still holds up, which was about, what then seemed like fantastical, which was, networking groups of surveillance cameras and being able to track individuals across, surveillance camera networks and being able to do Face ID and sort of, spot somebody, consistently, as they move from place to place. And that seemed very dystopian at the time and very fantastical, but obviously that's now no duh.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's so many stories from that era too, that I think at the time people had a hard time wrapping their head around it, and they weren't really ready to even conceive of how something like this would work. And, I think when the Snowden files dropped, one thing I was very confused by, and we were working together at Foreign Policy, literally as those were breaking, I was coming over there to work with you on the news side. And I had written a book 2 or 3 years earlier about surveillance. You and I had both been covering it. And I'm like, why is everybody acting like this is new? And this is somehow a revelation. And I think it was that the general public had just become sophisticated and savvy enough about technology that when the story was presented to them, they said, oh, I understand how this works. And, ooh, this is troubling, or this is something I want to know more about. Did you feel that way too? The story, it was the world had to catch up a bit to be ready for the gravity of what those documents told us.
Yeah, well, I just think, first of all, in general, there's beat reporteritis, right? Which is stuff in such fine-grained detail that sometimes you miss, when there's a big, or not miss, but, you don't feel the impact of a big story.
Yeah, you underappreciate it, yeah.
Yeah, so there's that part. And then, look, I think that stuff is still, there's still cycles of it going on. It's I feel like, you and I were jumping up and down talking about how crazy the amount of data we were giving to Google and Facebook was, and I feel like that's still an ongoing. People seem to wake up to it every few months,
right?
I remember, with drones, like, again, jumping up and down, being like, guys, this tech isn't that sophisticated. Like, everybody's like, this is going to proliferate everywhere.
Yeah.
Are you sure about this? Like, positive? And whatever. Now we know. And so, I mean, I just think that's part of it. That's all part of the cycle, especially when you're covering more like technology related subjects.
Do you think that we as an industry, looking back like in that 2013, 2014 period when NSA was so front and center in the news, did we put too much emphasis on the concern over the government having large amounts of personal data or access to data and not enough on social media companies having it?
Well, first of all, I mean, look, who was it? Was it Clapper or one of those guys said once, the government will kill people based on metadata, right? And will arrest people based on data, and will metadata and data. So, I mean, look, Facebook or Google is not going to kill you, at least, not in one fell swoop. So, I think there was an appropriate amount of emphasis there. I think where we probably missed the mark a little bit was, I think we sort of portrayed, we either portrayed the technology companies as kind of victims of an oppressive government, or of accomplices of that oppressive government, without interrogating enough. I think we did some, but without enough of like, wait a minute, these big technology companies are like independent and often malevolent actors in their own right. And we got to pay attention to that. I think at the time it felt more like, the privacy dangers were more framed around ad targeting and that kind of stuff. And it sort of seemed like, well, who cares if they know I like I prefer blue chiffon pants rather than blue jeans, it seemed the stakes seemed lower. And I think it was only, again, when you and I were working on the Russian disinformation campaigns of 2016, that like the stakes suddenly seemed like went from kind of ephemeral to enormous.
Yeah. And it's funny, I'm just having a flashback now to, I remember the day that, because I was working with you at the Beast, and it was the day that the IC came out and confirmed that Russia was behind the election interference. The grab 'em by the pussy tape dropped, and the Hillary Clinton emails all came out on the same day.
Was that all?
And I can remember.
Oh my God!
It was all the same day. I was in LA at a conference, thinking like I'd found this nice little like quiet window to go to a cool conference, and I remember like sitting in the auditorium listening to a panel and seeing this blow up, and like communicating with you and like having to file, and it was just absolutely nuts. I mean, it was one of the nuttiest days.
But I turn the clock back a little bit. My favorite memory, this is so telling on myself, but whatever, I don't care, is whatever that was, like July of 2016. And
I think so.
And there was like, the first like Russia FBI, Russia interference stuff was starting to break. And I was I was at this security conference in Aspen, Colorado.
I think we were both in Aspen, actually. Wouldn't we be? Yeah.
I don't know. Well, anyway, point being, unlike you, I was enjoying the fruits of Colorado's then relatively rare legal weed. And I remember being like, yo, this story's blowing up, but I am too fucked up to go confirm it. Shane, can you and Nancy Youssef, who we were working with at the time, can you guys go track this down? Because like, I cannot show up, with these, like, I can't go to the head of the FBI or whatever this stone.
With your pupils the size of quarters, and be like, hey man, it's fucked up what these Russians did, right?
Yeah, bro.
Wow. Yeah. I don't think I ever knew that was maybe like why you were indisposed on that.
No. That's why I think you're making. No, I was pretty clear about it at the time. I was. Yeah.
But but it is kind of crazy to like think back on that period as being, I feel, and this often happens in journalism, but I feel like we were all so innocent then, when it came to like the idea that like, whoa, the Russians have broken into a political organization's servers and they're going to leak all the emails. One thing, and this gets to the question of like, the postmortems. I wonder too, what do you think about the criticism that the press focused too much on the content of Hillary Clinton's emails and not enough on the fact that the Russians were leaking them in order to try and sway people's opinions in an election in which, we have a history of not allowing foreign governments to interfere in our election, like that we missed the big story. What's your sense of like how the industry performed there?
Well, I don't know about we. I know you and me didn't do that.
Right.
I think there's a lot.
We had many of those conversations, in fact. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was like, I think because you and I had been covering hacking and covering, kind of info ops for a long time, we kind of knew what the score was. And so, you covered the Hillary emails, but what we were trying to cover was like, what was either A, what was of substance in there, B, what was her like, had she done anything security risk? And then, we were handling those really gingerly because it was pretty clear that like, DC leaks or whatever was some kind of foreign op. And so, I thought we did okay on that. The we, you and me part of it. But yeah, no, there's a lot of, I think in some ways because, right, we were coming off the heels of some really big and really substantive hacks that, or like sort of mass document dumps, right, that like had done really important, that kind of like trolling through those dumps had been like hugely important, and there had been so many good nuggets of information in there. Yeah. I think it kind of like gave the industry a little bad training on the Hillary stuff. For example, the year before, there's those Sony hacks. Remember those?
Sure, of course.
Yeah. And we would go through those, and these aren't like world-shaking entertainment world-shaking national security stories, but they're hugely important in the entertainment world. Where like, I remember at the Beast, we broke the news off the Sony hacks that Jennifer Lawrence was being paid like half as much as her male colleagues, and that was like in the entertainment world, that was a world-shaking story. That was like, and has led to all kinds of pushes for pay equity and what have you. And so I think we're a little bit more used to like, those documents being important in the contents rather than the kind of meta contents.
And I think that we, it sounds like we're like patting ourselves in the back for all the great work we did together here. But I want to talk too about some of the Trump-Russia stories in this context. I particularly want to talk about a story that you and I didn't publish, if that's okay. I think you remember which one I'm talking about, because we've talked about this over the years. Kind of
like there's two related ones, right?
Well, the one I'm thinking of, and this is a way to get into like, the broader coverage too, but it was the whole question of whether or not a server at the Russian bank Alpha Bank was communicating with a server owned by the Trump organization, and whether the communications were meaningful and signaled possibly even that there was some like, weird like red line or phone line between the Kremlin and Trump Tower, right? And, for listeners, I spent weeks, I think, researching that story, constantly in communication with you.
I feel like it was a solid month you were on that story.
Yeah. It was a long time running that story down. And when we came up with it at the end, it was just like, there's a lot of interesting stuff here and none of it is conclusive. It definitely does not prove that Trump was communicating with the Russians. This could just be it was all DNS data. It was sort of like, interesting, but it was not anything definitive. And we ultimately decided like this story is not baked and we should not run it. It did eventually break and has never really held up, but like that's a moment where I think we had to step back and say like, look, this is potentially an explosive story, but like we just don't believe that this is actually provable. And we made the choice not to run it, and others didn't. Others made the choice to go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, so that story was being shopped around to a lot of places, let's be fair.
Yes.
And I think, you and I were not the only people to pass on that story. Let's also be fair. But, we ran it down. And if memory serves, Shane, I think we came away saying that the data we had been shown was indistinguishable from spam. Wasn't that right?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, if we can't tell the difference between that and spam, then we're not, we can't do this. Because if memory serves, the source was presenting this slice of data, but not the whole thing. And without the context, you couldn't tell what it was. Anyway, yeah, then they got some dummy, I think at Slate, to run with it, and it became a big thing. And honestly, stories like that actually wound up only helping Trump, right, and helping the Russians, because it was a story that was knockdownable, and so it could kind of like quote unquote disprove any connections between the Russians favoring Trump and it was kind of like a way to disprove that, which it wasn't, but it was just like bad stories like that actually wind up serving the targets rather than damaging them. Then the other one I thought you were going to mention was, I remember we didn't have the document, but we sure had heard about this crazy file on Trump, that it was accusing him of being a foreign agent. And we're kind of like, yeah, we heard these whispers, and then stories came out. They were sort of publishing these whispers, and we were like, what the fuck? This is so irresponsible. Like, to just sort of say someone was going to be shopping around. And then the thing that you and I didn't work on, but me and our entertainment editor worked on, was, we had an on the record source about Trump and Stormy Daniels. But it was only a single source, and we didn't feel like that source was completely trustworthy. And so
the source saying that they had a sexual affair.
Yeah. And Stormy was going to talk to us, and then at the 59th minute of the 11th hour backed out because she wanted to get paid. And we were like, no, we're not paying our sources. And that made us feel shady about the whole thing. So yeah, there's a bunch of stories we didn't run. And I'm really glad we didn't, and I think in retrospect, I love all my colleagues at, that worked at BuzzFeed at the time, but, I think that's why in retrospect, publishing the Steele dossier as is and kind of throwing up our hands and saying, oh, well, we don't know if this is real or not, but it's sure making the rounds. That was a really bad call. I also think in retrospect, look, Comey briefing the president on this, and or briefing the incoming President Trump, and kind of, I think, in retrospect, that feels a little bit like a put-up job, not a responsible disclosure. And so, Comey saying like, hey, dude, there's this file on you, watch out. That feels, I know Comey thinks of himself as the, 6'11" Boy Scout, but that doesn't feel like a Boy Scout move in retrospect. And so I just think the whole way information was handled back then, there's a lot of really important stuff coming out, and a lot of information that was like vital to both national security and to our politics. But then there was a lot of bullshit that was being sloshed around that I think made it harder to get at that real substantive, important, game-changing information.
Yeah. And so, I think, and it's an important part of the conversation, because I think that a lot of people, when they see big stories running in the press, and particularly when they see them, at a time, in digital media in which it seems like everyone is rushing to be first and to get the sharpest head on it, they can overlook the fact that there is a lot of painstaking work that's going on behind the scenes, and moments where people just step away and maybe you say, crap, we're maybe passing on a really good story here. But the risk that we take to our own reputations of publishing something that's wrong is prohibitive, A, and B, like, we're not going to publish something that we can't prove. And I think this is, to your point about what sometimes just gets, which doesn't really pass muster, but gets published anyway, it does embolden those people who would come out and say the press just makes things up and you can't believe anything you read, because so much of it just kind of falls apart. And,
doesn't mean you get every story right, like,
no, of course not.
You can play a hand of poker properly and still lose, but, you got to at least play it properly. And so, look, I think, for listeners out there, just know that like every big story, there's usually huge drama behind it and huge moments of like, wait a minute, should we be publishing this? Do we have enough? Are we sure about this one? That happens every big story. There's that moment of like, oh my God, are we sure we've got enough here?
Totally. Well, and I want to say this transitions nicely into like what you're doing now at Rolling Stone, because I think that, Rolling Stone has a history of deep, probing, provocative journalism. I mean, it was the home for Hunter S. Thompson, for God's sake. So it's not as though somebody who comes from your background of doing investigative work and, and like high speed and digital and policy and substantive, like would be out of place. I mean, running a publication like this, I think it makes all the sense in the world, as I said. But you've signaled also like very early on, and this gets back to what we talked about in the beginning about celebrities who like to be managed, is that you are taking an approach to covering people who are not used to having critical coverage of them. You're taking the same approach, it seems to me, that you would have applied to public officials when you were working at FP or Daily Beast. And you told my Washington Post colleague, Margaret Sullivan, that your quote was, "We are 100% going to shine a light on bad actors," and that you wanted Rolling Stone to stand apart from much of entertainment journalism, which, quote, tends to be either fawning and borderline embarrassing or pure gossip. And I think the first story that put you guys on the board is like living up to that promise is the piece that you did in the journalism you've done on Eric Clapton and his support for anti-vaxxers. So talk to me about how that story got started.
Yeah. So look, I thought it was important for a number of reasons to come out of the gate, shining a light on a bad actor who, not only someone who's a bad actor in the music business. And look, I'm not telling you or any of your listeners anything you don't know, but there's like a lot of bad people in the music business. There just are, it attracts them. And so, I thought it was important that we kind of expose one of them early on, and that the first one we do was someone that Rolling Stone had celebrated in their past. I thought that was important too, because, look, here at the Rolling Stone offices, we've got this sort of wall that digitally displays all of the covers going back, 50 plus years. It's super cool. But, you look at some of the people on those covers and you're like, yikes. Those were not great people. Now, look, to be fair, Rolling Stone had a history of re-examining some of its heroes. And so I think it was in 2018 or 19, they did a big expose on Johnny Depp, which really, turned around perceptions of him. And he is someone that had been on several Rolling Stone covers. So it's not like Rolling Stone hadn't done this in the past. But I think with the start of a new editor, I just thought it was important to kind of go after someone, big and prominent. And, we knew, if you're a rock fan, a real rock fan, you know that Eric Clapton's got this past of saying some pretty racist stuff, like crazy racist stuff. But even I was shocked at how bad it was, like, and just how many like holy shit racist statements he had made over the years. So we had a reporter that was digging into that, and he also dug into his anti-vax stuff, and he found that Clapton wasn't just like spouting anti-vax talking points, but had actually been funding this group of anti-vax protesters. And they were up to this is a good example of something you got to deal with in journalism, is they were insisting up until the like 59th minute of the 11th hour that they were not anti-vax, and that all they were freedom of choice, and that they had no problem with vaccines, and they just wanted people to have the option not to take it. And then we found this video of them like singing, "You can take this vaccine and shove it up your ass."
Wow.
It's like,
that sounds anti-vax.
And like a whole bunch of other stuff. And these guys were just lying, like right up until the end. And so we were able to do a classic magazine trick of like going back through and looking hard at history and kind of summing up lots of data points that we knew, get some news up at the top, and we were able to publish that, and that was great, and it was a good statement for us. And it was particularly sweet because I found out later that your paper, the Washington Post, had been working on a similar story, and so it was nice to beat you guys right out of the gate.
And how were Eric Clapton's people? Were they surprised that Rolling Stone was asking these aggressive questions?
Not entirely, because we had been doing some day-to-day reporting on Clapton, and he had sort of made some statements about how he didn't want to play anywhere with a hard vaccine mandate and stuff like that. So we were reporting on that, and Clapton had actually, even before the big story came out, Clapton was like ranting on Facebook about us. So no, and in fact, I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong, but I don't think it wasn't until Clapton, who, again, I should just note, Clapton still claims he's not anti-vax, right? But he went on the podcast of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the world's most prominent anti-vaxxer, who also claims he's not anti-vax, to complain about us. And that was like a month after the story, and I think that was the first time he said anything after the big story.
Yeah. How do you separate now going forward too? And this I think this is a question that has really become one we all talk about in the era of Me Too. How do you separate Eric Clapton and his music, which is, I think everyone agrees, is a gigantic contribution to culture and is wonderful, and many of us love it a lot and have for years, from the individual Eric Clapton and the kinds of things that he is advocating that are arguably detrimental to public health? Like, you as an editor now who has to make these decisions about what you cover, how you balance your coverage, how do you distinguish between these realities, which are just basic human facts? We all have contradictory aspects to our personality, but you've got to grapple with this now as an editor.
Yeah. I mean, well, a couple of things. First of all, I mean, I think Clapton's music is overrated. And
this is going to be the headline of the podcast, man, right there.
Well, I mean, look, and Clapton in '68 told Rolling Stone, said so much racist stuff about Jimi Hendrix that I can't even repeat it on this podcast. Yeah, but I think Clapton's kind of overrated. He played in some good bands, but he himself is a little wrong. And also, look, in this case, right, like some of his past behavior actually plays into some of his art, right? This is a guy that spent his whole life like pretending to be the avatar of blues, which is, inherently a black art form, while talking shit about black people. This guy's biggest hit for so many years was a Bob Marley cover while he was talking shit about black people. Like, I feel like in his case, like the art and the actions are linked in a way that it may not always be. But look, we're going to try to treat those things. We're going to try to treat the artist and the person as separate when we can. If one has nothing to do with the other, so be it. And then sometimes we'll treat it together when we can. And so, a good example of together is our other big expose so far. It was on Marilyn Manson. And, Marilyn Manson has had this shock persona and this kind of evil lyrics and, since the jump. And there was an example of people saying, well, that's just his persona. That has, that's just his art. It has nothing to do with who he is as a human. And it turned out it had everything to do with who he was as a human. And this guy was, has been accused of abuse and torture and worse over the decades, and he would sing about it too, and everybody was like, "Oh, ha ha ha! He's just a prankster. He's just trying to get our goat. We won't fall for that. We are too sophisticated for that." And it turned out, no, he was just singing about his reality. So I think you can go. So I think it's important when warranted to separate the art from the artist, but sometimes you can't be like too clever by half. Sometimes those things go together.
How do you feel now about Michael Jackson and his legacy?
That's a tough one, man. That is a really tough one. Personally, I'm still wrestling with it, and it freaks me out. I remember, I don't know when it was, like a year or two ago, and one of my kids was singing "Man in the Mirror," and he's like a 7-year-old boy or something like that, and it freaked me the fuck out. I don't know. I'm still wrestling with it, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think there aren't. It's probably case dependent and specific, but I think one of the things you're getting at here that's interesting is it seems like you are very much in favor of asking how the person's beliefs and personality affect their art and influence it, and that is completely fair game as a subject for journalism. I certainly think that's true, but that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, totally. And I think also we want to be careful about like, if people are doing non-political art, right, even though they may, or if they're doing stuff that is more neutral to their personality, like that requires a different kind of treatment than someone who's like, Marilyn Manson, who's like talking about torturing people in his songs, and then was torturing people in real life.
Right. Seems highly relevant.
Yeah.
In the few minutes we have left, since you're feeling spicy, all right, most underrated and most overrated musician of the past 20 years, or maybe not most, but just who comes to mind?
Wow, man, that is tough. I have a secret. I had a formerly secret love for this band, the Hives, who I feel like never quite got their due. And I feel like in that era of like the Strokes and the Vines and stuff like that, the Hives were like by far the best of that band, of that era. And I feel like never got their due. So I feel like they're kind of criminally underrated and underappreciated. I also feel like there's an era that's kind of now past a little bit, unfortunately, but in the like 2014 to 17 era, like the music coming out of Jamaica right then, of artists like Protege, Chronix, Kabaka Pyramid, and folks like that, has been like criminally overlooked and should be like the biggest pop music in the world. So that's some overlooked artists. Would you say the other one was like overhyped, or like?
Yeah, or is there like a genre that's it was just played out? You think it was like, we'll look back and say, God, what were we thinking? I mean, there's tons of those.
Oh,
which one stands out to you?
Holy cow! I mean, it's almost like there's too much of that. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's almost like there's too much of that. And look, I mean, I think one of the dangers you can have in this job here, and I think one of the things I'm gonna try to fight against, is confusing popularity in the moment with good.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I'm going to try my hardest to celebrate artists who are, and put artists on the cover who are both good and speak to a wide audience.
Yeah. But, and I think like in the era of the pandemic now too, I feel like people's relationship with music has probably changed profoundly. People are going back to live music events now. Friends of mine who go to concerts, this has been one of the things that they have been so missing in their life, and they're so glad that it's back. Do you think about how the pandemic has affected people's relationship with music, or does it feel more like, when it comes to what you guys cover, how you think about artists, that this was just a rough period and we got through it, and maybe music helped a lot, and now we're just kind of, moving on from it?
Yeah, I don't think about it quite the way you did, but I've definitely noticed that, like, music that gives you the feels and really, that you can, cry with and cry to, and you can dance around in your underwear too and feel joyous. Like that feels particularly precious in this moment. I thought Rolling Stone, this predates me, but I thought Rolling Stone did a really nice piece on Dua Lipa maybe like 9-10 months ago, sort of expressing that. I think you also see like, the huge and very well justified reception for Taylor Swift's reimagined Red album, and just how much emotion is poured into that. I think some of that has a pandemic fuel to it.
Yeah.
And then look, we like all of us at Rolling Stone, like we can't wait to get back to live music, and B are like watching like a hawk to make sure that it's done safely. And so, we did a bunch of reporting over the summer, sort of before I got here, but on spread of COVID at certain big events, and COVID policies at certain big events, and then we're reporting the shit out of what's going to be a really ongoing story, which is the tragedy at the Astroworld concert in Houston, where I believe now 10 people have died as a result of their
It's
injuries.
awful.
Yeah, really awful. And to what degree the promoter, the sort of artist and artistic director, Travis Scott, the Houston PD, and many others were responsible. We're still getting to the bottom of. But Rolling Stone, in a lot of ways, some of its best journalism ever was in the aftermath of similar tragedies, whether it was at Altamont or the Who concert in Cincinnati, or the Roskilde festival in the 2000s, and so we see this as kind of hip hop's Altamont moment, and we're going to treat it as such.
Yeah, that seems to make perfect sense. All right, our tradition on Chatter is our very last question comes from the Chatter box that I hold in my hands right here, which you'll have to trust me. It's real. I'm going to pull a previously written question at random, and then I'm going to ask it to you, and that'll be our last question.
Right on.
Name one dead political or national security related leader from any era that we could really use now. If you could reanimate.
Wow. Oh, man. Honestly, God, this is so funny because, after college, I quit college to unseat this guy. But man, I feel like we could use a George H.W. Bush figure right now. And I don't share his politics or his worldview necessarily at all, but somebody who was like a coalition builder, who, was basically somebody who talked sense and who had a bit of decency to him. Even and kind of like was small c conservative in the best sense. I feel like our politics could really use a guy like him right now, because it feels like all we've got are these kind of like right now it's like mushy liberals, fiery leftists, and neo-fascists, and it feels like those are like our three like kinds of politics, right? Like strains of politics right now, and we could use like a real kind of like old school internationalist in this moment. I guess the other person I'd say is Ike, for the same reason. And it's so funny, man, because like these are not people like I would necessarily like politically align with.
Right, exactly.
Well, I guess the other ones I would say are like, I feel like we could use like a David Ben-Gurion type who could speak to the aspirations of the Middle East without getting into the kind of necessarily some of the ugly tribalism there. Could elevate the conversation. I feel like we could really use in a time of rising neo-fascism around the world, I feel like we could use an FDR type too, who could really speak to our, make the forceful case for anti-fascism. I feel like that would be great to have.
Yeah.
So
it's about temperament too with so many of these people that I feel like is what we've lost now as well. I mean, I think of like George H.W. Bush, not dancing on the grave of the Soviet Union when you could imagine any American president would have felt perfectly within their rights to do, and he didn't. I think he even got some criticism for that.
Yeah, or not taking the bait and chasing Saddam after the Gulf War.
Right. There's that.
Yeah, my old man, who's a book author and who for a while had met a bunch of the presidents in a row. I know he had met Carter and Reagan and George H.W. and I think Clinton too. And my old man always said that H.W. was the smartest of the lot. And my dad, to be clear, co-wrote a book with Jimmy Carter. So it's not like he wasn't in the tank for HW, but anyway, so I feel like that's someone we miss, and then I feel like right now, also just journalistically, like we just need to we're going to really need some really fierce national security reporting coming up, really fierce. And it's going to have to be, super skeptical of both of government sources, of international sources. And it's going to have to be fiercely non-ideological, really fiercely. And too many people have taken the partisan bait on national security reporting and are trying to come up with stories that confirm their biases, whether it's around this fucking Wuhan lab stuff, or whether it's around whatever Putin's up to on the edges of Ukraine. There's a lot of really big issues that I think we're sort of like allowing our national security reporting to fall into camps, and I think we got to get at some really aggressive ground truth. And I have a feeling that, Biden's going to be increasingly tested on the world stage over the next couple of years. And that, the confluence of foreign interests in the 2024 campaign is going to be like completely off the charts. And so, that's what, I'd say that some more of that is on my wish list too.
Yeah, I think it's going to be, I think you're right. 2020, I hope we're remembering the lessons that we've learned, and politics national security used to stop at the water's edge when it came to politics. These streams have blended in a way that is, in the past 4 or 5 years, it is totally alien to me as a national security reporter, and probably the way you grew up too. And I think maybe it's time to get back to basics.
Yep.
All right, my friend, Noah Shachtman, editor-in-chief, Rolling Stone, great American, my friend. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate you taking your time out of, lunch with Eric Clapton's publicist and telling him, why you don't actually hate him.
Yeah, something like that.
All right, well, say hi to Adele for me, okay?
Okay, will do. I'll ask to take it easy on you.
Oh, very nice.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.
The Lawfare Podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Please share the podcast, rate the podcast, tweet about the podcast, spread the word about it, and also mention Chatter to everyone you talk to about the Lawfare Podcast. This episode is edited and produced by Jen Potchahowell. Kara Schillen from Goat Rodeo helped us with the audio for Chatter and for the Lawfare Podcast crossover episode. Sophia Yan performed our music. As always, thanks for listening.